This week, NASA named 4 astronauts who have the right stuff. Their mission returned to the moon 50 years after the Apollo flights ended. The crew includes the first woman and first black astronaut on a lunar mission. Here's Mark Strassman.
Wait a minute, I thought you said we never went to the moon, and now they claim to be returning?
No, we never went to the moon. And neither is this group.
Are you one of those conspiracy nuts that I've heard about on the news?
I'm one of those guys who investigates others' claims to see if they stand up to what they claim.
The TV says that's what nutty people do.
Well, then I'm just going to have to be a conspiracy nut. Let's take a look at this news story about NASA's return to the moon.
Ladies and gentlemen, your Artemis II crew.
NASA's deep space hopes will rocket with this crew
To the moon, to Mars, and beyond.
Moon-bound astronauts, the first in more than a half-century.
Wait a minute, they just said we went to the moon 50 years ago. You're not saying they are lying, are you?
Lying is a harsh word to use, and I do know the answer to your question. Being a conspiracy nut. But let's let the facts speak for themselves. Then you can decide whether NASA is lying or not.
We know how big this moment is, and I personally feel it's so much bigger than me and my name being attached to it.
On this diverse Artemis II crew, 3 Americans, all space veterans, and a Canadian. Reed Weissman, a U.S. Navy captain and the mission commander. Victor Glover, the first black astronaut to make a long-duration spaceflight. Christina Cook, a member of the first 3 all-female spacewalks, and Canadian Jeremy Hansen, the only space rookie aboard.
Our focus is 100% on being successful in this vehicle.
After launch, the Orion capsule will reach the moon in 4 days for a lunar flyby.
But first, let's take a look at some interesting information that seems to contradict what we've been told about Apollo's many trips to the moon.
Okay. But I haven't seen anything yet that causes me to doubt NASA's story.
Orion is getting ready to launch. My name is Kelly Smith, and I work on navigation and guidance for Orion. Orion is NASA's next-generation spacecraft. Built with versatility in mind, it can take astronauts deeper into space than we've ever gone before, to an asteroid or even onto Mars. For these missions, Orion has to be one tough spacecraft, withstanding high speeds, searing temperatures, and extreme radiation. Before we can send astronauts into space on Orion, we have to test all of its systems. And there's only one way to know if we got it right. No astronauts will be aboard. The spacecraft is loaded with sensors to record and measure all aspects of the flight in every detail. It all begins with launch, aboard a Delta IV, as the spacecraft and the upper stage begin their first lap around Earth. Mission Control in Houston is monitoring the progress of the flight. Orion's over 100 miles up and going about 17,000 miles per hour. Just as it passes over the Indian Ocean, we lose communication. As we get further away from Earth, we'll pass through the Van Allen belts, an area of dangerous radiation.
The Van Allen belts start at 1,000 miles above the Earth and reach out as far as 25,000 miles.
Radiation like this could harm the guidance systems, onboard computers, or other electronics on Orion. Naturally, we have to pass through this danger zone twice, once up and once back.
But here comes the part that doesn't make sense.
But Orion has protection. Shielding will be put to the test as the vehicle cuts through the waves of radiation. Sensors aboard will record radiation levels for scientists to study. We must solve these challenges before we send people through this region of space.
What he just said throws a monkey wrench into NASA's story about the Apollo missions. Is it starting to get a bit clearer to you?
I don't see how they could have gone to the moon before they solved the radiation problem. That's like putting the cart before the horse.
Let's see if this story gets any more doubtful.
It's great to be a part of this first space flight for Orion, and we're looking forward to beginning a new chapter in human space exploration.
Flyby. This crew could push deeper into space than any humans ever before finishing their 10-day mission. What's critical? This flight will be the first test of Orion's complete life support systems. NASA envisions the moon as a proving ground for eventual missions to Mars.
Do you now look at the moon a little differently?
Oh, yeah. 100%. We've spent our entire lives looking up at the moon. And now we're going to go out there and look back at Earth from that same distance. That is crazy.
Some of their Artemis training will happen right behind me in NASA's mock-up Orion capsule. That training starts in June, goes on for 18 months, which means that the Artemis II launch could happen as soon as late next year. Mark Strassman, CBS News in Houston.
Okay. Let's take one last look at a bit more contradictory information before we come to any conclusion. This is from my video, Wagging the Moon Doggy, which is based on the great work of author Dave McGowan.
One thing they like to talk a lot about is the Van Allen radiation belts. The moon hoax sites talk a lot about them as well. The hoaxers will tell you that man cannot pass through the belts without a considerable amount of radiation protection. Protection that could not have been provided in the 1960s through any known technology. And the debunkers claim that the Apollo astronauts would have passed right through the belts quickly enough that, given the levels of radiation, no harm would have come to them. The hoaxers say debunkers are just being girly men. As it turns out, both sides are wrong. The debunkers, shockingly enough, are completely full of shit, and the hoaxers have actually understated the problem by focusing exclusively on the belts. We know this because NASA itself, whom the debunkers like to treat as virtually unimpeachable source on all things Apollo, except, apparently, when the agency posts an article that implicitly acknowledges that we haven't actually been to the moon, has told us that it is so. They have told us that in order to leave low Earth orbit on any future space flights, our astronauts would need to be protected throughout the entirety of the flight, as well as, and once again this comes directly from NASA, while working on the surface of the moon. On June 24, 2005, NASA made this rather remarkable admission. Quote, NASA's vision for space exploration calls for a return to the moon as preparation for even longer journeys to Mars and beyond. But there's a potential showstopper, radiation. Space beyond low Earth orbit is awash with intense radiation from the Sun and deep galactic sources such as supernovas. Back in the 1960s, of course, we didn't let a little thing like space radiation get in the way of us beating the Ruskies to the moon. But now, I guess, being that we're more cultured and sophisticated, we want to do it the right way, so we need to come up with a way of shielding our spaceships and our temporary moon bases. And figuring out how to do that, according to NASA, could be a real, quote, showstopper. As NASA notes, the most common way to deal with radiation is simply to physically block it, as the thick concrete around a nuclear reactor does. But making spaceships from concrete is not an option. Lead, which is considerably denser than concrete, is actually the preferred material to use for radiation shielding. But lead also isn't very popular with spaceship designers. In fact, word on the street is that one of the main reasons the Soviets never made it to the moon was because their scientists calculated that 4 feet of lead shielding would be required to protect their astronauts. And those same scientists apparently felt that spaceships wouldn't fly all that well when clad with 4 feet of lead. Now NASA is thinking outside the box and contemplating using force fields to repel the radiation, a seemingly ridiculous idea that, whether workable in the future or not, certainly wasn't available to NASA in the 1960s. Below is NASA's own artist rendering of a proposed force field radiation shield that would allow astronauts to work safely on the moon. As you may have noticed, in the earlier photos of lunar modules, our guys didn't bring anything like that with them on their earlier missions to the moon. And you might have also noticed that the modules didn't have any type of physical shielding. He's got the pictures up here, guys. You have to check it out on the website. How then did they do it? My guess is that the answer lies in that gold foil wrap. While it may look like an amateurish attempt to make the modules appear more high-tech, I have a hunch that what we're looking at is another example of that lost 1960s technology, this time in the form of a highly advanced superpolymer that provided maximum radiation shielding while adding virtually no weight. So all we have to do is track down a few leftover rolls of that stuff, and we should be well on our way to sending guys back to the moon. According to Charles Bueller, a NASA scientist currently working on the force field concept, quote, using electric fields to repel radiation was one of the first ideas back in the 1950s when scientists started to look at the problem of protecting astronauts from radiation. They quickly dropped the idea, though, because it seemed like the high voltages needed and the awkward designs that they thought would be necessary would make such an electric shield impractical. What a real journalist would have asked here, of course, is, quote, after dropping the electric shield concept, what exactly did they decide to use to get our astronauts safely to the moon and back on the Apollo missions? And why can't we do the same thing now, rather than reinventing the wheel? Don't you guys have some of that gold foil in a closet somewhere? No one in the American media, of course, bothered to ask such painfully obvious questions. The 2005 report from NASA ends as follows, quote, but who knows, perhaps one day astronauts on the moon will work safely. Unquote.
So, what do you think? Are you convinced NASA has been lying?
It sure doesn't look good. Why don't we wait to see if they actually make an attempt to go around the moon with Artemis 2?
My guess is that it'll be all talk and no action, as it has been for the last 50 years. Okay, fair enough, we'll wait and see. Goodbye.
So long, conspiracy nut. See you later.
This week, NASA named 4 astronauts who have the right stuff. Their mission returned to the moon 50 years after the Apollo flights ended. The crew includes the first woman and first black astronaut on a lunar mission.